Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Hey guys, tonight we're going to sink into something a little older than usual. Like 5,000 years old, clay tablet old. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's drift back to a time when people thought sacrificing a goat was a reasonable way to keep the weather in check. Because apparently, umbrellas weren't an option yet. Let's start where civilization itself apparently began, in a place historians like to call Sumer, or, as I like to think of it, the world's first experiment in organized confusion. The Sumerians, inventing ritual and regret down in Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates. People were doing their best to not get flooded every spring. They built cities, invented writing, and of course, created a full-time job category called priest. Because someone had to explain to the gods why the beer ran out again. Now, the Sumerians loved their gods the way modern people love online shopping, passionately, expensively, and constantly. Every city had its own divine mascot. Uruk had Inanna, goddess of love and war. Nippur had Enlil, who was basically their divine weather manager. And every temple had rituals so complex that you could spend your entire life preparing offerings and still get smote for forgetting the incense. One of the most charming bits of Sumerian ritual life was the sacred marriage ceremony, where the king, yes, the king, symbolically married the goddess Inanna every year, which sounds romantic until you realize he had to act it out with a high priestess, in public, while everyone else watched and clapped politely. Because nothing says divine fertility like awkward ritual intimacy under the desert sun. The point was to make sure the land stayed fertile, the herds multiplied, and everyone got enough barley to survive. Did it work? Probably about as well as any other political promise. But they kept doing it for centuries, so at least it kept the priesthood employed. The Sumerians were also pioneers in another great human tradition, ritual complaining. They wrote entire hymns and prayers begging their gods to stop sending droughts, plagues, or excessive bureaucracy. One clay tablet even preserves what might be history's first customer service complaint. A man upset that his copper shipment was late. Not exactly a ritual, but still proof that some habits never die. Let's float a little west, where the sand glows gold and everyone was obsessed with eternity. Ancient Egypt. Because one life wasn't enough, Egypt, land of pyramids, eyeliner, and 4,000-year-old bodies still looking better than most of us on a Monday morning. Egyptian rituals were, in a word, extra. Everything was sacred. Eating, sleeping, brushing your coal, it all tied back to maintaining Marat. That delicate cosmic balance, the Egyptians were convinced, would collapse if you sneezed too aggressively near a tomb. Their obsession with the afterlife produced some of the most meticulous rituals in human history. Take mummification, a process so long and complicated it makes modern skincare routines look lazy. First, you remove the brain through the nose. Why? Because apparently, the ancient Egyptians decided it wasn't needed for eternity. The heart, however, stayed. They believed it was the seat of thought and emotion, which explains a lot about how their pharaohs made decisions. Every step was accompanied by chants, offerings, and the occasional symbolic gesture of protection from Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming. Picture a group of priests in linen robes, carefully anointing a royal corpse with oils, while reciting spells to keep evil spirits away. Then multiply that by 40 days. That's how committed they were to spiritual insurance policies. And of course, there was the opening of the mouth ritual, performed on statues and mummies to give them the ability to breathe, eat, and speak in the afterlife. A priest would touch a special tool, shaped like a small adze, to the lips of the deceased and declare them officially open for eternal business. Imagine a cosmic version of activating your phone plan, but with more incense and fewer customer service hold times. The Egyptians took ritual cleanliness to heart too. Priests shaved every bit of hair from their bodies and bathed multiple times a day. Ordinary citizens left food offerings at home altars and muttered little prayers before drinking beer, which, yes, was a daily ritual. Because if you lived in 45 degrees Celsius heat, surrounded by crocodiles and bureaucracy, you'd need a drink to dot now. Let's leave the Nile's calm sands and drift toward a civilization that didn't get enough sleep because it was too busy inventing plumbing. Indus Valley. Where order was the ritual, the Indus Valley civilization was tidy, quiet, and infuriatingly mysterious. We can't read their script, so archaeologists have to guess at most of their rituals based on ruins and tiny seals, which is like trying to reconstruct a religion from someone's fridge magnets. Still, what we do know is fascinating. Their cities, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, were grid-planned with uniform brick sizes, complex drainage, and public baths that make you wonder if ritual cleanliness was basically their national sport. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro might have been the scene of ritual purification ceremonies. Picture early mornings, mist rising, citizens stepping quietly into the cool water, washing away both dust and bad vibes. No idols, no loud chanting, just methodical calm. Very on brand for a civilization that apparently didn't believe in chaos. They also had small figurines that might represent a Proto-Shiva figure, seated cross-legged with horned headdress, which hints at early fertility or meditative rituals. Whether they worshipped him, meditated like yogis, or just liked making symmetrical art, we may never know. But whatever they did it neatly. Even their trash disposal was organized. A true miracle of civilization, the Minoans, dancing with bulls and decorating for the gods, alright. So picture the island of Crete about 3,500 years ago. Sunshine, sea breeze, and a palace complex so big and confusing that archaeologists named it after a mythical labyrinth. Because, apparently, walking in circles was a Minoan specialty. The Minoans were the original aesthetic civilization. Everything they built looked like it was designed for Instagram. If Instagram had existed in 1700 BCE, frescoes of dolphins, women with elaborate curls and tiered skirts, men jumping over bowls for sport. Yes, bull leaping was a thing. It seems to have been a kind of ritual performance, maybe religious, maybe just to impress someone. We don't know for sure, but we do know people were actually vaulting over charging bulls. The Minoans called it worship. Modern historians call it poor risk assessment. The bull, of course, was sacred, tied to the god Poseidon and possibly to a great mother or fertility goddess. So every spring, these ritual games celebrated life, death, and gravity, all in one majestic jump. The athletes were young, graceful, and probably very bruised. Their rituals weren't limited to the palace either. The Minoans had cave shrines and mountain sanctuaries where they left offerings, pottery, figurines, sometimes weapons. Archaeologists have even found what looks like miniature altars where they poured libations of oil or wine. It's hard not to imagine some ancient priest standing on a windy ridge, mumbling a blessing, and hoping the gods didn't mind if the cup slipped. But what really sets the Minoans apart is their quiet devotion to beauty. Their religious art doesn't scream power or fear. It's full of color, movement, and calm. You don't get the feeling they were terrified of their gods, more like they were trying to impress them with interior design. If Egypt was all about eternity and order, the Minoans were about joy and rhythm, ritual as performance, worship as art, and possibly pole vaulting as cardio. Now let's drift east again, to a civilization that loved its rituals almost as much as it loved philosophy, ancient China. Ancient China. The rituals of balance and bureaucracy in China took ritual seriously, like really seriously. If the Sumerians invented worship and the Egyptians perfected death, the Chinese systematized ritual itself. The earliest dynasties, Shang and Zhou, saw ritual as the foundation of cosmic order. Everything had to be done properly. Sacrifices, music, clothing, posture, even the tone of your voice when bowing. Because one wrong note, and you might throw off the balance of heaven and earth. The Shang kings liked to communicate directly with their ancestors using oracle bones. They'd carve a question into a turtle shell, apply heat until it cracked, and interpret the lines. Should we go to war? Crack. Will it rain tomorrow? Crack. Basically, divine texting, but slower. Ritual sacrifice was common to animals, food, sometimes humans. The idea was to feed the spirits and keep the ancestors happy enough not to meddle. And because the Shang loved hierarchy, the more important the ancestor, the bigger the feast. By the Zhou period, rituals became even more formalized. They believed every social role, ruler, noble, peasant, had a correct set of behaviors. Ritual wasn't just religion, it was social glue. If everyone bowed, poured, and spoke exactly right, society stayed harmonious. The Chinese word li means both ritual and propriety. That tells you everything about their mindset. You didn't just perform rituals for the gods. You performed them to stay human, which is poetic, but also exhausting. And yet, there's a strange comfort in it. Imagine living in a world where even pouring a cup of tea felt like maintaining cosmic balance. You'd move slower, speak softer. Maybe that's why ancient Chinese art feels so meditative. Even their rituals sound like a mindfulness exercise. Let's float south now, where things got more colorful, and occasionally more bloody. The Mayans, calendars, kings, and cosmic payments welcome to the jungles of Mesoamerica, where rituals weren't a side activity. They were life itself. The Maya believed the world was alive with gods who needed constant attention. Sun gods, rain gods, maize gods, all of them demanding little acts of devotion to keep things running. Their kings were expected to act as middlemen between the human world and the divine. This often meant bloodletting rituals, which sound dramatic but were actually routine. A noble or king might pierce his tongue or forearm, drip a few drops of blood onto paper, and burn it as an offering. Pain, they believed, opened a direct channel to the gods. And they didn't do this in private either. Whole plazas filled with spectators would gather to watch the ruler perform these sacred acts. It was divine theater, a little bit political, a little bit masochistic. They also tracked time like no one else. The Maya calendar wasn't just a tool, it was sacred math. Every date had its own spiritual energy, and rituals were timed to align with cosmic cycles. Imagine planning your week not by deadlines, but by which God was in a good mood. Of course, when times got bad, droughts, famine, political collapse, the rituals scaled up. That's when they turned to more dramatic offerings, including human sacrifice. But let's keep it gentle here. That's not the bedtime vibe. So we'll just say the Mayans were committed, deeply, cosmically. If devotion could power a civilization, they'd still be here today. Now, before we drift off, let's end tonight's journey somewhere quieter. A civilization that's been literally swallowed by sand and mystery. The Nabataeans, carving faith from stony oak, probably heard of Petra, that rose-red city carved into cliffs. The Nabataeans built it. Traders, desert dwellers, and architectural overachievers. They made the middle of nowhere feel divine. Their rituals weren't flashy, no bull leaping, no pyramids. They worshipped gods of nature, water, and fertility, often blending influences from surrounding cultures. Their altars were simple, carved niches in the rock, open to the sky. Offerings of incense, wine, or oil were poured in silence. There's a quietness to their religion that fits the desert, a reverence for stillness and space. They built high places for sacrifices, climbing the cliffs to meet the divine halfway. From those heights, you could see miles of sand and stone shimmering in the heat. It must have felt sacred by default. And though we don't know every detail of their ceremonies, we do know this. The Nabataeans left no grand texts, no sermons, just carvings, cups, and echoes. Their worship seems to have been about presence, being there, offering something small, and listening. Maybe that's the purest ritual of all. Excellent. We'll continue part 1. Surprising rituals from lost civilizations, right from where we left off. Keeping that low energy, mildly sarcastic history as a lullaby tone. This section will meander through a few more civilizations before easing toward the end of part 1, the Celts. Singing to trees and talking to heads somewhere in the damp mists of Iron Age Europe. The Celts were out in the woods performing ceremonies that made Roman soldiers very uncomfortable. The Romans wrote about them constantly, usually with the tone of someone describing a neighbor's strange lawn decorations to the Celts. The natural world was soaked in spirit. Every river, oak, and hill had its own divine personality. If you wanted a good harvest or safe journey, you left a little offering, maybe a piece of jewelry, maybe a coin, maybe something you borrowed from a friend and didn't plan to return. They're druids. Those priestly figures wrapped in white robes presided over festivals that marked the shifting seasons. The most famous was Samhain, the original Halloween, and Beltane, the original excuse to light a bonfire. People believed that during Samhain, the boundary between worlds thinned. Spirits wandered. Cows got nervous. So villagers left food outside to keep the dead polite. The Romans accused the Celts of human sacrifice, but evidence is scarce. More likely, they practiced smaller, symbolic offerings and a lot of ritual feasting. There's archaeological proof of enormous cauldrons filled with meat and ale, which, honestly, sounds like a fine religion to the Celts. Song itself was a ritual. Bards weren't entertainers. They were keepers of memory. Each melody was an offering to the ancestors. Imagine standing in a misty grove, a harp echoing, voices chanting names that had already turned to legend. You can see why they didn't rush to invent writing. Memory was sacred enough. The Hittites. Bureaucratic, magic, next stop. Anatolia, around 1300 BC, where the Hittite kings ran their empire with clay, tablets, and meticulous anxiety. If the Egyptians ritualized death and the Chinese ritualized order, the Hittites ritualized damage control. Every time something went wrong, plague, rebellion, thunderstorm, they performed elaborate ceremonies to identify which god was annoyed. A typical Hittite ritual started with an inspection list: which animals to sacrifice, how much beer to pour, which words to chant. Sometimes the priestess was told to smear honey on a figurine, wrap it in wool, and throw it in the river, symbolic cleansing. Other times, the ritual required building tiny models of houses or ships and burning them to carry away evil. It's like ancient customer support with fire. They even had a ritual called the substitute king. If bad omens predicted the king's death, they would crown a stand-in, usually a gardener or prisoner. Let him rule for a few days, then retire him permanently. The logic was that fate would get confused and take the wrong guy. Dark, yes, but efficient. Every spell, charm, and prayer was recorded in the archives. The Hittites turned magic into paperwork. Somewhere, a royal scribe was probably muttering, "I just file curses. I don't write them." The Olmec's heads, jaguars, and rain across the ocean again, deep in early Mesoamerica. The Olmecs were carving colossal stone heads and worshipping a strange mix of jaguar and human deities. No one knows exactly what their rituals looked like, but the art gives clues. Half human, half feline figures, babies with fangs, rulers in trance-like poses. Scholars think they performed shamanic transformations, using hallucinogenic plants and rhythmic drumming to commune with the spirit world. Rain and fertility were central themes. The Wurjagar, that grimacing figure seen everywhere, might represent the storm god. Offerings of jade, rubber balls, and even infant effigies were found buried near springs, gifts to ensure water kept flowing. If you've ever been stuck in a tropical storm, you can imagine the appeal of trying to negotiate with the weather. The Olmecs weren't so much worshipping rain as bargaining with it. And unlike later Mesoamerican civilizations, their rituals feel quieter, more mysterious, more personal. Less about spectacle, more about trance and transformation. The Etruscans, reading the sky for bad news before Rome took over the world. It borrowed half its religious habits from the Etruscans. These were the people who turned ritual into a full-time forecasting business. They believed the universe constantly sent messages. You just had to interpret them correctly. To do this, they used haruspicy, examining animal livers, and augury, watching birds. Priests carried little bronze models of livers marked with divine zones, like an ancient celestial map when lightning struck. They didn't just say, "Wow." They called a specialist, called a fulgurator, to record the time, direction, and intensity, then declared which god had sent it and why. It was basically the ancient version of reading the comment section of the sky. Etruscan rituals were strict. Specific tools, specific words, specific gestures. They even taught Rome how to perform the foundation ritual, digging a trench, offering wine, and tracing the city's boundary with a plow. Every Roman city began that way, including Rome itself. So next time someone says ancient rituals are pointless, remember that an entire empire was built on one: the Persians. Fire and purity, let's glide east once more to ancient Persia, home of Zoroastrianism. One of the world's oldest still living religions, at its heart was fire, the visible symbol of truth and divine presence. Temples kept sacred flames burning constantly, tended by priests who recited hymns called gathas in a language already ancient to them. Zoroastrians saw the world as a moral battleground between good Ahura Mazda and evil Angra Mainyu. Rituals were less about sacrifice and more about purity, washing hands before prayer, filtering water, avoiding pollution of earth and fire. They even placed the dead in towers of silence, open stone structures where vultures completed the cycle cleanly, without defiling soil. Compared to bloodier traditions, it's refreshingly calm. Light a fire, speak truth, do no harm. The sort of spirituality that could double as good life advice. A gentle drift toward duskand that travelers is where we'll rest for tonight. We've wandered through dusty temples and damp forests, from Sumerian beer offerings to Persian sacred flames. We've watched kings pretend marry goddesses, priests consult livers, and entire cities bathe for purity. If there's one thread through all of it, it's this: every civilization, no matter how distant or strange, used ritual to make sense of the chaos, to feel like someone or something was listening. Maybe that's why, even now, we still light candles, knock on wood, or whisper little promises to the universe. Old habits survive better than monuments. So, close your eyes. Picture the faint smell of incense, a chorus of forgotten prayers echoing through the centuries. The fires burn low. The gods, for once, are satisfied. Sleep well, the echo of forgotten fires. So here we are, standing at the end of several thousand years of incense smoke. We've watched Sumerian kings marry goddesses for better crops. Egyptians open mouths so the dead could talk again, and Mayan nobles politely bleed for cosmic balance. Every one of them was trying to keep the universe running on schedule. And what's funny is how ordinary that instinct still feels. We might not sacrifice bulls on mountaintops anymore, but we still blow out candles and make a wish. We still cross our fingers before big moments, as if the gods are hiding somewhere nearby, waiting for hand signals. Ritual never really went away. It just learned to wear modern clothes. The ancient world lived by cycles: sunrise, flood, harvest, death, rebirth. Every ceremony was a way of saying, please let tomorrow look like today. The more unpredictable life felt, the more complicated the rituals became. You can see it in every fragment: the careful repetition, the whispered formulas, the offerings lined up in perfect rows. It wasn't superstition so much as choreography, a slow dance against chaos. Imagine, for a moment, a night in Sumer. The temple torches flicker. A priest recites lines carved into clay 200 years before he was born. Outside, the river hums, the same river that carried the first bricks of the first city. Somewhere far away, a family lights a small lamp and bows toward a household altar. Different scales, same motion, a rhythm older than writing. Civilizations crumble, languages die, but the small gestures survive. The offering, the prayer, the glance toward the sky before a journey. Even now, in an age of satellites and self-checkout lanes, we build little rituals without noticing. Coffee before dawn, music before work. Tiny moments that tell the universe, I'm here, I'm ready. Don't break today. Maybe that's what those ancient ceremonies were always about. Not control, not fear, just the comfort of routine in a world that rarely made sense. Because whether you're a Sumerian farmer, a Minoan dancer, or a modern insomniac listening to history at 2 a.m., the feeling's the same. You do the thing you know. You trust the pattern. You wait for morning. So, as we close tonight's chapter, let the dust settle over the ruins. The temples are quiet now, their gods sleeping behind cracked stone. The fires fade to embers, and the last echoes of chant drift out across the centuries. Take a slow breath. Feel the weight of all those forgotten prayers, hanging in the dark like stars you can almost see. You've walked through thousands of years tonight. That's enough. The past will still be here tomorrow. It always is. Sleep well, traveler. Tonight, we're going deeper. Not into pyramids this time, but into the dim corners of belief. The places people whispered about, not wrote about. The secret societies, the hidden cults, the quiet worship that governments and temples pretended not to see. Let's start where secrecy was practically a lifestyle. Ancient Greece, the Eleusinian mysteries. Don't ask, don't tell for nearly 2,000 years. The Greeks held one of the most famous secret rituals in history, the Eleusinian mysteries. They were so secret that no one who participated ever spilled the details. Not once. Which, honestly, makes them the only ancient organization better at confidentiality than modern tech companies. Here's what we do know. The mysteries were dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, the mother and daughter at the heart of the myth about life, death, and rebirth. Every year, initiates walked from Athens to Eleusis in a grand procession, chanting and carrying torches. Along the way they fasted, purified themselves, and prepared for whatever came next, which was classified. Inside the sanctuary, something happened that was said to erase the fear of death. People emerged transformed, glowing with what one poet called the hope of a blessed afterlife. Historians suspect there was a symbolic reenactment of Persephone's descent into the underworld. Darkness, loss, and then a sudden burst of light. Some think the initiates drank a potion made from barley and wild herbs, possibly laced with something mildly psychedelic. Because if you're going to meet the divine, you might as well make it interesting. What's remarkable is how democratic it was. Anyone could join, men, women, even slaves, as long as they spoke Greek and hadn't committed murder that week. For a society obsessed with hierarchy, that's surprisingly wholesome. The mysteries lasted until the 4th century CE, when Christian emperors shut them down for being pagan nonsense. And just like that, the greatest secret ritual of the ancient world vanished, leaving behind a few poems, a handful of ruins, and the suspicion that maybe, just maybe, they had figured out something worth keeping. Let's drift east, where another mystery was unfolding, one with more wine and fewer boundaries. The cult of Dionysus. Divine chaos in a Kuptha Dionysian cult was the opposite of Eleusis' quiet dignity. Where Eleusis whispered, Dionysus screamed. He was the god of wine, madness, and theatre, basically. The patron saint of losing control gracefully. His followers, called Maenads, gathered in the countryside to dance, sing, and sometimes overdo it. They wore ivy crowns, carried wands tipped with pine cones, and shouted Eve, an ecstatic cry somewhere between prayer and party chant. Ancient writers accused them of wild excesses, but those reports mostly came from men who weren't invited. In truth, the rituals seem to have been about release, letting go of the tight restraints of Greek society, even for a night. Participants believed Dionysus dissolved boundaries between man and woman, mortal and divine, self and nature. They drank wine as a kind of sacrament, believing that God himself entered through the cup. It wasn't just drunkenness, it was transformation. Modern scholars compare it to trance states, the kind you reach through music, rhythm, or, let's be honest, a really good playlist eventually. The Romans adopted the cult and, predictably, panicked about it. In 186 BCE, the Senate banned Bacchanalia, claiming these secret rites threatened moral order. Translation: people were having fun without official permission. Still, the cult survived underground for centuries, proving that you can outlaw pleasure, but not curiosity. Let's leave the vineyards and move to a colder, darker devotion, one that involved fire, silence, and a certain bull that didn't make it out alive. The Mithraic mysteries, soldiers, caves, and cosmic bulls. Imagine you're a Roman soldier stationed on a bleak frontier. You've been paid late again, you're cold, and the local tavern ran out of wine. Then someone tells you about a secret brotherhood, a place where men gather in candlelit caves to share a meal, swear loyalty, and talk about the stars. That was the cult of Mithras, born in Persia. Mithra was a god of light and truth who somehow got repackaged for the Roman Empire as a kind of cosmic action hero. His most famous image shows him slaying a bull, not out of cruelty, but as a sacred act that renewed the universe. The bull's blood became life. The stars, his witnesses, Mithraic temples, called Mithraea, were small and cave-like, symbolizing the cosmos. Initiates moved through 7 grades of initiation, each tied to a planet, from raven to father. They shared ritual meals, washed in sacred water, and probably spent a lot of time pretending they understood the astronomy behind it all. The cult was exclusive. No women, and mostly spread through the army. It offered structure, loyalty, and the promise of salvation without the paperwork of traditional Roman religion. By the time Christianity rose, the two faiths looked suspiciously alike. Both had sacred meals, salvation myths, and a divine savior figure. But history has a way of picking favorites, and Mithras quietly faded into the dark. His temples were sealed, his followers scattered, and his bull finally got some rest. Now, let's float south to the sands again, where the line between God and Pharaoh blurred into one long ritual of power. The Egyptian cult of Isis. The eternal mourner. Egypt never really did small religion. Everything was grand, shiny, and slightly over. And yet, one of their most famous cults was born out of grief. Isis, the goddess of magic and motherhood, wasn't just worshipped. She was adored. Her story, like most Egyptian myths, began with death. Her husband, Osiris, was murdered and chopped into several pieces by his jealous brother, Set, because apparently ancient divine family drama was just as messy as any royal one. Isis wandered the Nile in mourning, collecting the pieces of her husband's body one by one. When she finally found them all, well, almost all, she reassembled him, breathed life into him, and conceived their son Horus. That's devotion. Slightly unhinged devotion, but devotion nonetheless. This myth turned into one of the most powerful emotional stories of the ancient world. The cult of Isis spread far beyond Egypt to Greece, Rome, and even Britain. Her temples became places of purification, initiation, and emotional renewal. Isis was the grieving widow, the powerful magician, and the protector of sailors. Her followers prayed for safe voyages and comforted the mourning. They also participated in annual passion plays reenacting her search for Osiris, complete with music, incense, and enough tears to fill a small canal. What made her cult special was its accessibility. Men, women, slaves, foreigners, everyone could join. While other religions were full of rules, Isis offered empathy. She wasn't distant. She wept, she healed, she listened. Eventually, the Romans, who had a love-hate relationship with imported gods, tried banning her cult multiple times. It never worked. The goddess kept coming back. Like a divine subscription you couldn't cancel. When Christianity rose, Isis slowly faded, but not completely. If you look closely, her image, mother with child, gentle and serene, quietly survived in another form. You might have seen it in a few churches. Let's drift on, west now, to a place where initiation involved masks, darkness, and a few existential questions that probably didn't help anyone sleep. The Orphic rites, music, death, and rebirth. The Orphic tradition was named after Orpheus, the musician who could charm stones and trees with his songs, and who famously tried to rescue his wife from the underworld. He almost made it, too, until he looked back. Classic mistake. The Orphics believed life was a cycle of birth, death, and purification. They saw the human body as a kind of temporary jail for the soul, not exactly a cheerful bedtime thought. But they meant well. Initiates followed a vegetarian diet, avoided beans for some reason, and performed quiet purifications meant to cleanse the soul. Their main goal was to escape reincarnation, to stop the cosmic hamster wheel and finally rest among the stars. The Orphic hymns, about 80 of them survive, were recited softly at dawn or twilight. They were prayers to gods of nature, fire, and night, written in gentle, rhythmic verses that sound like they were made to be whispered. Unlike the big public festivals of other cults, Orphic rites were intimate. There were no parades, no sacrifices, just music and meditation. A spiritual soft launch, if you will. Philosophers, like Plato, later borrowed from them. The idea that the soul is eternal, that it remembers, that the divine can be found through contemplation. So, if you've ever sat staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., wondering about your past lives, congratulations, you're part of a very old tradition. Let's wander now into the Roman world again, where secrecy met ceremony and incense mixed with politics. The cult of the emperor, divine bureaucracy now. Not all secret rituals were about enlightenment. Some were about power and keeping it polished. In Rome, emperors weren't just rulers. They were gods in waiting. After a particularly popular emperor died, the Senate might officially declare him divine. This was called apotheosis, which sounds impressive, but mostly involved a well-timed funeral, a bit of fire, and someone swearing they saw the emperor's spirit flying upward. Priests of the imperial cult maintained temples, held festivals, and made offerings to the emperor's genius or spirit. It was less about faith and more about loyalty. If you joined the ritual, it meant you were on the right side of the empire. For ordinary people, these ceremonies were part religion, part political performance. Offer some incense, say a prayer for Caesar, and you could go back to your day. Refuse, especially after Christianity appeared, and things got awkward fast. The emperor cult blurred every line between religion and government. Imagine if your national anthem also required you to burn a candle to your president's soul. That's the level of devotion we're talking about. Of course, not all emperors deserve divine status. Caligula declared himself a living god while still alive because patience wasn't his thing. He even built a temple to himself with priests who had to sacrifice daily in his honor. You'd think that level of self-confidence would keep him happy. It didn't sink so. Yes, even in Rome, divinity could be a performance. And like all performances, it eventually closed. Let's move now to the Far East, where ritual wasn't secret, it was everything. The Shang dynasty. Speaking with ancestors, China's Shang dynasty, around 1600 to 1046 BCE, had a religion based on talking to the dead. Not in a spooky way, in a routine, bureaucratic way. They believed their ancestors watched over them, influencing everything from crops to weather to royal decisions. So the kings, naturally, made it official business to stay in touch. They used oracle bones, pieces of turtle shell or ox scapula, which were inscribed with questions and heated until they cracked. The pattern of cracks was then read by diviners, like cosmic text messages from great-grandpa. Questions ranged from military campaigns to hunting trips to whether it would rain next Tuesday. Some even asked if the king's toothache would go away. It was all very procedural. Light the fire, read the crack, record the answer. Ancient spirituality with paperwork. Rituals also involved wine offerings, bronze vessels, and sacrifices, both animal and occasionally human. Because apparently, the ancestors liked to keep things dramatic. What's interesting is how organized it was. Each generation expanded the ritual system, keeping exact records. You can almost hear the sound of bronze bells echoing through the ancestral halls. A slow rhythm of devotion and duty taught to the Shang. Religion wasn't a choice. It was administration. And the king wasn't just ruler, he was the chief communicator with the unseen world. A man whose job description literally included talks to ghosts. Let's float forward a few centuries, to a different empire that turned ritual into an entire social operating system. The Druids. Quiet forests and loud secret sleds. Step softly into the misty forests of Iron Age Europe, where the Druids wandered, priests, philosophers, and part-time political advisors wrapped in wool cloaks. They didn't write anything down, which was either very mysterious or very inconvenient, depending on how you feel about record keeping. Almost everything we know about them comes from the Romans, who described them with the same tone you'd use for neighbors who keep chanting at 2a.m. According to Julius Caesar, and he wasn't exactly unbiased, the Druids oversaw every kind of ceremony. They settled disputes, ran schools, organized sacrifices, and occasionally burned people in giant wicker cages. The last part might be propaganda, but it's the detail everyone remembers. What's more likely is that Druids performed seasonal rites in sacred groves, honoring nature's cycles. They watched the moon, read the stars, and probably told time better than Caesar's calendar. They believed that souls were immortal and simply moved from one body to another. A comforting thought if you lived in a time when half your friends were probably lost to a stray boar or winter frost. They worshipped outside, never in temples. The world itself was sacred enough. And unlike most priestly classes, Druids were also teachers. They trained students for 20 years before letting them graduate. Imagine 20 years of memorizing hymns, tree names, and what certain bird calls meant for the harvest. You'd either become enlightened or deeply tired. When the Romans finally conquered Gaul and Britain, they banned Druidism, calling it barbaric. But even centuries later, locals still whispered about stone circles and solstice fires. The rituals faded into folklore, like echoes in the fog. Let's follow that mist west across the ocean, to another civilization that saw blood, time, and gods as part of the same conversation, the Aztecs. Blood for the sun, the Aztecs had one of the most structured, organized, and, let's say, energetic religious systems in history. Their entire worldview revolved around balance. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world, and humanity's job was to repay that debt. With a little interest, they believed the sun god. Huitzilopochtli needed nourishment to keep rising each morning. That nourishment, unfortunately, was human blood. So yes, their rituals were elaborate, solemn, and also not exactly bedtime material. Every major festival featured offerings to specific gods. Priests fasted, sang hymns, and painted themselves in symbolic colors. Victims, often prisoners of war, were treated as honored guests before their final moment. It wasn't cruelty in their eyes. It was duty, cosmic maintenance, like paying a very intense electricity bill. The Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan stood at the heart of these ceremonies, a towering pyramid that symbolized the center of the universe. From there, priests climbed hundreds of steps to perform rites high above the city, with thousands watching below. The drums, the chanting, the incense, it must have felt overwhelming, terrifying, and strangely sacred all at once. But not every ritual was violent. Some involved offerings of flowers, feathers, or self-inflicted bloodletting, a drop from the ear or tongue given in gratitude. Kings and nobles did it too. Power meant participation. It's easy to judge from a distance. But to the Aztecs, these acts were the heartbeat of existence. Without them, the sun might stop. And nobody wanted to find out what eternal night looked like. When the Spanish arrived, they called the rituals savage. But to the people who performed them, it was simply keeping the cosmos alive. You don't get more committed to a morning routine than that. Let's stay in Central America, but shift a little south, to a culture that worshipped through calendars, blood, and astronomy, all while pretending math was a spiritual experience. The Maya, timekeepers of the sacred If, the Aztecs were dramatic, the Maya were meticulous. They turned ritual into a kind of cosmic scheduling system. For them, time wasn't just passing. It was sacred. Every day had a divine meaning, a personality, even a spirit. Priests tracked it all using intricate calendars that made modern planners look lazy. Their rituals, whether for harvest, rain, or coronations, were scheduled down to the exact celestial alignment. If Venus was in the wrong position, you waited. You didn't argue with the stars. The Popol Vuh, their sacred book, tells of gods who created humans out of maize dough. Yes, the same stuff used for tortillas. Life itself was a recipe, and every offering, incense, dance, or bloodletting was a way of thanking the gods for not starting over again. Bloodletting was a big deal. Rulers used obsidian blades or stingray spines to draw a few drops, often during major ceremonies. The blood was burned with copal incense, its smoke carrying prayers skyward. The Mayans also practiced divination, communicating with ancestors through trance states and vision serpents, spiritual symbols that appeared in the rising smoke. It sounds hallucinatory, and honestly, it probably was. Temples doubled as observatories. Priests climbed steep pyramids, not just for height, but perspective, to see where heaven and earth touched. Their most sacred spaces weren't filled with noise. They were filled with calculation, rhythm, and awe. When the Spanish arrived, they tried to erase it all. But the cycles of time, the Tzakan and Hob, survived in the memories of descendants who still honor them today. Quietly, without blood, but with the same reverence for time's endless turning. Let's move now to another corner of the world. where ritual wasn't about gods demanding blood, but about ancestors sharing tea, the Japanese Kofan era. Keys to the afterlife. During Japan's Kofan period, around 3rd to 6th century CE, people built enormous, keyhole-shaped tombs for their rulers. These were massive earth mounds surrounded by moats, some stretching longer than football fields. They weren't just graves, they were messages to eternity. Inside, archaeologists have found bronze mirrors, swords, armor, and small clay figures called hanua. Little people, horses, even houses, placed around the tomb like a quiet crowd. No one's sure exactly what they meant, but it seems they represented attendants or guardians for the afterlife. Imagine being buried with an audience made of clay, eternal social anxiety, but in silence. Rituals around these tombs probably involved purification rites, processions, and offerings of food and drink. Early Shinto beliefs blended with older animistic traditions, turning funerals into community ceremonies that linked the living and the dead. There's a stillness to it. No fear, no spectacle, just continuity. The emperor didn't die. He joined the ancestors, who were still very much part of the household. The idea wasn't to mourn. It was to maintain harmony. Let's take one last detour before we close this part, to a civilization that turned death itself into a communal art form, the mocha of Peru. Rituals in red and golden, the northern coast of ancient Peru, long before the Inca. The mocha built pyramids out of mud brick and filled them with scenes of ceremony. Their pottery tells stories better than their language ever did. Mocha rituals were about power, fertility, and sacrifice, though not always human. Priests and priestesses wore towering headdresses, shimmering in gold, as they poured libations or performed animal offerings. When human sacrifice did occur, it was deeply symbolic. Chosen warriors who had lost ritual battles, offered as gifts to appease the gods of rain and war. In one famous site, archaeologists found the remains of the Lady of Cow, a high-ranking woman covered in tattoos of snakes and spiders, buried with fine jewelry and weapons. She was likely a priestess or ruler, proving that spirituality and authority weren't always divided. The mocha seemed to see ritual as art, the performance of life and death captured forever in clay. They didn't just worship their gods, they reenacted them. The divine was something you did, not just believed in. When their civilization faded, the ceremonies didn't vanish. They transformed, blending into the cultures that followed. The same way the tide reshapes the shore but never leaves it empty. And that's where we'll gently rest for now, surrounded by incense smoke, echoes of drums, and the soft shuffle of forgotten priests. Every civilization we've passed tonight, from the Greeks whispering in torchlight to the Maya watching Venus rise, shared the same quiet instinct to reach beyond the visible, to touch meaning, even if it meant a little blood, a little mystery, or a lifetime of careful silence. Because in the end, rituals weren't about gods needing worship. They were about humans needing rhythm, and that rhythm still hums beneath everything, steady, ancient, and very, very sleepy. So here we are, having wandered through the secret corners of the ancient world. From torchlit Eleusinian caves to candlelit myth, from the silent oracle bones of Shang kings to the humming pyramids of the mocha, humans have always had a way of hiding the divine in plain sight. Some rituals were loud, some were quiet, some involved wine, others involved blood, and a few involved staring at a crack in a bone until someone made sense of it. All of them, though, shared one thing: the attempt to reach beyond ordinary life, to make sense of existence, to negotiate with forces that seemed just beyond comprehension. And what's remarkable is how many of these rituals were designed for normal people. Not just kings, not just priests, not just the chosen few. The Eleusinian mysteries welcomed slaves. Isis's cult welcomed sailors and mothers. Even Mithras, despite being male-only, offered structure, camaraderie, and hope. Sometimes it was about power. Sometimes it was about fear. Sometimes it was just about rhythm, the pattern of chanting, the measured steps, the shared motion. The world was chaotic, unpredictable, and often dangerous. Ritual offered an anchor. It's easy to look back and call them superstitions, curiosities, or even madness. But when you do, you forget one thing: they worked. Not in the sense that the sun never stopped rising or the rains never failed, but in the sense that they gave people comfort, meaning, and a sense of order in a world that often made no sense at all. And maybe that's why, even now, humans cling to tiny rituals. Morning coffee, a quick prayer, flicking a light switch 3 times because the first 2 aren't right. It's the same instinct, just dressed in modern clothes. So, as we let the candles burn low and the incense fade, imagine all the secret ceremonies that never made it into history books. The whispers in caves, the quiet chanting in forests, the prayers carried up smoke shafts, the careful arrangements of offerings on stone altars. They're gone, yes, but in a way, they're still with us. In the need for pattern, for order, for tiny gestures that say, I notice, I care, I am here. Let the thoughts settle in your mind like a soft drumbeat. The ancients are gone, but their rhythms hum quietly beneath everything we do. And for tonight, it's enough to know that somewhere, across millennia, someone else performed the same small, deliberate acts that make life feel a little more manageable. Breathe slowly. Let the echoes drift away. The secrets of the past are at rest, and now, so are you. Sleep well. We're going smaller, more personal. Not kings or priests, but ordinary humans, farmers, merchants, sailors, and the strange things they believed would keep them safe. It's the kind of history you can almost smell. Dust, herbs, candle smoke, and occasionally, the faint tang of paranoia. Ancient Rome, knock on wood. Odontramens were masters of public ceremony. But at home, they were just as obsessed with luck, signs, and omens. They believed in good and bad spirits, lares and pinities that haunted their homes and kitchens. You couldn't just eat a loaf of bread without acknowledging them. A little offering of wine or incense, and they'd be happy. Skip it, and expect the bread to mysteriously mold faster. The superstition went beyond spirits. Romans consulted the flight of birds' augury for everything, from planting crops to choosing a wedding date. A crow on the left. Bad news on the right. Still probably bad news, but slightly less so. If a dog sneezed while you stepped out the door, that meant something. Which dog and how loudly could drastically alter your day, and the gestures. Romans made gestures to ward off evil. They would touch the chin, point fingers, or spit discreetly to deflect misfortune. Imagine walking down a street with everyone making secret motions, convinced the world is just one sneeze away from disaster. Some habits were downright practical. Carrying charms and amulets helped people feel control over unpredictable circumstances. It's easy to scoff, but there's something calming about small, repeatable actions. Ancient china, paper, dragons. and the fear of fire over. In ancient China, daily life involved a careful balancing act with spirits and ancestors. People hung paper talismans in their homes. Some wards were for health, others for prosperity, and some, more paranoid, were to keep demons from tripping over their furniture. Dragons weren't just for decoration. They were protective forces, weather gods, and occasionally judgmental supervisors. If your rice didn't grow well, the village might hold a small ritual, burning incense and chanting poetry to placate the dragon. Sometimes it was just about convincing your neighbors that you were spiritually responsible, which, in a society obsessed with appearances, was basically the same thing. And then there were everyday taboos. Don't sweep after sunset. Don't cut your hair on unlucky days. Don't point at the moon, or it might be offended. Yes, someone somewhere wrote a guide to living where literally every action could bring cosmic punishment. These habits weren't arbitrary. They were a way of structuring life, turning uncertainty into ritualized behavior. Even a minor superstition, knock on wood, spit over your shoulder, carry a red thread, gave a sense of order. Medieval Europe, chicken bones and candle wax. Fast forward a few centuries to medieval Europe, where superstition crept into nearly every household. Farmers carried charms for good harvests, sailors for safe voyages, and children for avoiding witches. People believed that leaving chicken bones in a field could protect crops, or that pouring melted candle wax into water could tell the future. The shapes predicted marriage, death, travel, or small inconveniences that would ruin your week. Every village had its healer or wise woman, dispensing potions, charms, and advice. A little herbal tea here, a pinch of salt there, and suddenly misfortune seemed manageable. Because if you can't control the world, at least you can control the rituals. Even kings weren't immune. They consulted astrologers, carried lucky stones, and slept with amulets. Power didn't protect you from superstition. If anything, it demanded it. The Vikings, runes and rituals at home in Scandinavia. Everyday life also came with ritual. Vikings carved runes into wood, bone, or stone for protection, victory, or even a little romantic luck. Before a voyage, they might leave an offering to Odin or Thor, a small piece of mead, a bit of food, a whispered prayer that the ship wouldn't sink. Hearth rituals were equally important. Fire was sacred, and keeping it alive meant safety. If the fire went out, it wasn't laziness, it was danger. You might relight it carefully, murmuring words to encourage good spirits to return. Vikings also believed in luck in practical ways. A sword left in the wrong place could anger spirits. A poorly laid meal might offend the household gods. Every small gesture counted towards survival, which makes sense if you live in a land where winter lasts half the year and bears are excellent neighbors. Ancient Japan. Lucky charms and tiny rituals in early Japan. Superstition blended seamlessly with Shinto belief. People carried omamori, little charms in cloth bags, for safety, health, and success. They left offerings at shrines, bowed before trees, and occasionally apologized to rocks for stepping on them. Even the smallest actions were washing hands before entering a temple, bowing before a sacred tree, speaking softly in certain spaces. The daily practice of mindfulness, wrapped in superstition, made life predictable. It was less about fear, more about rhythm and connection. Ancient Japanese routines may have looked odd to outsiders, but they offered calm. The same calm we feel when performing a simple morning ritual today. Everyday superstitions across the globe What's fascinating is how similar all these rituals were, even across continents. Knocking, touching, chanting, carrying charms. Humans everywhere seemed to agree on one thing. Small, repeated actions could influence a chaotic world, from Europe to Asia to the Americas. Touching something to bring luck, avoiding a small taboo to prevent misfortune, leaving tiny offerings for invisible forces. It wasn't superstition for the sake of it. It was structure, comfort, and a tiny illusion of control. And really, isn't that what rituals are, even today? A way to make sense of the things we cannot see or predict. Medieval Europe, omens, witches, and everyday fears continuing in Europe. Superstition wasn't just a pastime, it was survival. People believed the world was full of unseen forces, and you never knew when a minor misstep might bring misfortune. Take witchcraft, for example. Not everyone accused of being a witch was actually casting spells. Sometimes it was the lady who always had a surplus of herbs, or the neighbor who grew better vegetables than anyone else. Still, precautions were everywhere. Salt in the doorway, a horseshoe above the hearth, or a small charm hidden in a pocket could save you from envy, illness, or a bad harvest. Even the calendar was fraught with superstition. Some days were unlucky to travel. Others were considered bad for marriage, childbirth, or even haircuts. The phase of the moon dictated planting schedules, weddings, and small decisions about everything from cooking to cleaning. It's hard to imagine a world so detailed, so rigidly structured around invisible influences, and yet somehow it worked. People also consulted omens constantly. Birds, the way cows behaved, a sneeze at breakfast. Each small event could mean something significant. A rooster crowing at the wrong hour. Bad luck, a black cat crossing your path. Absolute panic in some villages. For a modern mind, it seems excessive. But for someone living in a time when plagues, famine, and unexpected death were normal, every small action to curry favor with the unseen world made sense. Every superstition was a tiny insurance policy. The Middle East, protection, prayer, and everyday ritual in ancient and medieval Middle Eastern societies. Daily rituals intertwined faith with superstition in subtle ways. People carried amulets to protect against the evil eye, a curse thought to be caused by jealousy or envy. Even today, the idea persists. Little charms shaped like eyes, symbols, or small inscriptions meant to ward off harm at home. Herbs, incense, and water were used in purification rituals. Before journeys, travelers might sprinkle water, recite prayers, or tie a small talisman to their belts. The emphasis wasn't dramatic spectacle. It was quiet, repeated habit. A reminder that divine favor might accompany the mundane. Certain phrases were repeated as protection. If you sneezed, someone might say, "God protect you," a small verbal charm echoing centuries of belief. Even routine actions, eating, drinking, starting a journey, became small ceremonial acts. In essence, superstition and piety blended so thoroughly that it was impossible to separate daily life from the spiritual safeguards surrounding it. Africa. Ancestors, spirits, and daily life cross Africa. Rituals were woven into the rhythm of life. The ancestral spirits weren't distant. They lived in the home, the land, the river, and the fire. Daily offerings, a few grains of millet, a sip of water, a whispered acknowledgement kept the connection alive. Some communities used divination for everyday decisions, planting, travel, or resolving disputes. A diviner might cast bones, read cowrie shells, or interpret the behavior of animals to predict outcomes. To modern eyes, it may seem quaint or arbitrary, but to people who relied on intuition and inherited knowledge, it was guidance, practical, culturally embedded, and deeply trusted. Even illness and recovery often involved rituals. A small ceremony, the touch of a healer, or an offering to a household spirit could determine whether you believed you would get better. And belief, in many cases, was half the cure. Aboriginal Australia, songs, dreaming, and ritual. Indigenous Australians had another way of integrating belief into everyday life. The Dreamtime, a complex system of mythology, lore, and history, informed how people lived, moved, and interacted with the land. Rituals weren't just occasional ceremonies. They were embedded in daily life. Walking a path became a retelling of ancestral journeys. Hunting and gathering became a dialogue with spirits of the land. Songs, dances, and stories were simultaneously spiritual and practical. Through these actions, knowledge was passed, the environment respected, and human life harmonized with the unseen world. Even small acts, leaving offerings at a sacred site, honoring an animal, or performing a morning chant, kept people in alignment with forces they could not see but deeply understood. Rituals as patterns. Across time and space, looking across these cultures, one pattern emerges. Ritual was about rhythm, repetition, and control. Humans have always tried to make sense of chaos, whether through prayer, charm, divination, or careful observation. People created systems to reduce uncertainty. Small rituals, knocking on wood, offering incense, wearing amulets, bowing to spirits, were consistent across continents. The tools, gods, and gestures changed, but the instinct remained. Order, repetition, protection. Even habits we perform today, morning coffee, a lucky coin, checking the weather before leaving the house, are echoes of this ancient impulse. It's soothing to realize that we are not inventing anything new. We're just following the same human need that people in Mesopotamia, China, Africa, and Australia followed thousands of years ago. Absolutely. Let's continue. Part 3. Strange beliefs and everyday superstitions of the ancient world. Now moving into rituals surrounding death, pregnancy, and health, all the quiet, personal practices that humans performed to feel safe and in control. Death and mourning. Everyday superstitions around the Endocross, the ancient world. Death was never just an event. It was a transition, a process, and a source of constant ritual in ancient Egypt. Funerary rituals were elaborate, predictable, and designed for eternity. Families mummified bodies, laid out offerings of food, drink, and small treasures, and recited prayers to guide the deceased safely to the afterlife. Even minor items, like amulets placed in wrappings, were meant to protect the soul from wandering spirits or hostile forces. But not all cultures were so. Meticulous in medieval Europe, funeral superstitions were more immediate. People believed the recently dead could become restless, returning as spirits if not properly honored. You'd place coins on the eyes to keep them shut, or sprinkle salt and holy water to protect the living. Sometimes, neighbors stayed up for the vigil, not just out of respect, but to ensure the corpse didn't rise prematurely, a pragmatic sort of fear really in China. Death rituals were equally detailed. The color white dominated mourning garments, while incense and offerings maintained connection with ancestors. Family members performed bowing and ceremonial gestures to ensure the deceased remained at peace. Neglecting these rituals risked spiritual unrest, bringing misfortune or illness upon the living. Even in Africa and Oceania, mourning involved daily practices, planting symbolic crops for the deceased, leaving food and drink at home, altars performing dances and songs that reminded the community of ancestors' guidance everywhere. Death wasn't final, it was a continuum, and rituals were small acts meant to influence outcomes, protect the living, and honor those who had gone before. Pregnancy and childbirth. Rituals for the fragile pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous for both mother and child, so rituals abounded. In ancient Rome, expectant mothers wore amulets called bulla for protection. They also observed taboos, avoiding certain foods, avoiding seeing ill-omened animals, and reciting protective prayers. Even the father's behavior mattered. A nervous or reckless father could jeopardize the newborn, or so they believed. In China, expectant mothers were often secluded for weeks, performing quiet rituals to ensure the child's health. They might burn incense, hang talismans, or participate in small ceremonies to invite protective deities. Names were chosen with extreme care, often incorporating symbols of longevity, strength, and virtue. In Africa, midwives and family members performed rituals during labor, reciting prayers or chants, preparing protective amulets, using symbolic herbs or oils to ensure safe delivery. Even small acts, like placing an object under the mother's pillow, were believed to influence the child's future. It was superstition, yes, but also preparation, a tangible way for a community to manage fear in a situation fraught with risk, health, and food. Rituals to stay alive. Humans have always been obsessed with staying alive. From ancient Mesopotamia to Europe, daily health rituals intertwined with superstition. In ancient Mesopotamia, amulets, spells, and incantations protected against disease. Sick individuals might wear charms, have priests recite protective words, or burn incense to cleanse the air. Doctors existed, but magic often supplemented medicine, just in case the herbs didn't work. In medieval Europe, similar practices prevailed. Garlic, salt, and herbs weren't just seasoning, they were protective agents. People wore charms to avoid plague or smallpox, recited prayers before meals, and took care to avoid unlucky days for medical treatment. Even cutting a hair or trimming nails followed superstition. Doing so at the wrong time might invite illness. In Asia, practices were equally detailed. Chinese medicine integrated spiritual elements, incense, chanting, talismans, and precise timing. Food was ritualized. Certain ingredients were consumed at particular times to balance yin and yang. Even a simple meal became a quiet act of protection, aligning body, spirit, and environment. Protection in daily life. Small acts, big meaning across all regions. Small protective rituals were everywhere. Hanging charms, above doors knocking on wood burning incense, or herbs whispering prayers, performing gestures to ward off evil. Sometimes these actions were practical, keeping insects away, keeping animals from wandering, avoiding accidents. Other times, they were symbolic, reinforcing the connection between human life and the unseen world. And in every culture, the repetition mattered. It wasn't enough to perform a ritual once. Daily life demanded rhythm, repeated actions, repeated words, repeated habits. The repetition created comfort, order, and predictability in a chaotic world. Even now, Centuries later, humans retain echoes of these practices. We touch lucky coins, perform morning routines, or carry objects that give us confidence. The forms have changed, but the purpose remains the same. A quiet way to feel safe and prepared.